It has this auto feature on it that will look for faces.
Oh, I think so.
That really bothers me that it's going to the window.
Is there a face on the other side?
I would love the idea that like somebody was outside and they heard us describe what the camera was doing, and then there was an awkward pause, and then we just heard the footsteps run away.
Yeah, that would be pretty scary, and I would keep the drapes drawn all the time.
Okay. I am Danny Province of Central Michigan University, interviewing
Rebecca Conklin, also now of Central Michigan University.
and we're going to be discussing your experience in China. Can you tell me about what program you were in China working for?
So I went over to China in 2008, right after I graduated my undergraduate program. And when I went over the first time, because there were 2 times that I went over, I was associated with a program called Appalachians Study Abroad. No, Appalachians Teach Abroad. And so basically this was sort of like a middleman program that connected me with a bunch of different school options. And then from the options, I chose a school that I wanted to go teach at, which happened
in China.
In China, in Shanghai. So it was called Appalachians Teach Abroad because it was a program through Marshall University, and my college was in the Appalachian Mountains, so similar region. But you didn't actually have to be from that area to use the program. It was just sponsored by that area and sort of promoted in that area. So like some of the other people that used the program were from California, New York, West Virginia, Florida, like all over.
Okay. So when you were in the program, who were the people, like once you were in China, who were the people that you would communicate with on a regular basis?
In the very, very beginning, mostly other foreigners, because we had a few days before any of our training started. And then even within our training, we were kind of spoken to by the administrators of the school.
Like they basically like lectured you guys about what the training would be and stuff like that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then, so most of my heavy interaction was mostly with other foreigners. I went to China not speaking any Chinese, so that really limited my ability to communicate with other people. Once the school year started, I communicated a lot with my students, probably actually the most with my students because I was in class probably about 5 hours a day. And then my office mates, but they were also all foreigners, so the foreigners and the Chinese were separated. The Chinese had their own office and the foreigners had their own office. So yeah, a lot of interaction with foreigners actually in the beginning.
Okay, and then what were you doing for the university at the time?
For the school where I was teaching,
Mm-hmm.
I was teaching, so it was an international high school, and I was teaching English and history the first year to primarily 9th, 10th, and 11th graders.
What area of history?
World history. So a vast expanse of history that included like ancient history up to like modern day Asian history. So it was interesting. And it was all to non-native English speakers who were from, it was an international school, so they were all from different Asian countries. So Japan, Korea, mainland China, and then Hong Kong and Taiwan as well.
So it's not like they were all a homogenous language group.
No, not at all. So a lot of them would speak Korean and Chinese and English as a third language. A lot of them would speak maybe just Chinese and English. Some of them would speak basically just maybe Japanese and English. So although they had to take, half their day was in Chinese and half of their day was in English, but that didn't really necessitate that they spoke either of those languages. So there was really like a huge, a real diversity in the linguistic population there.
Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through in order the groups that you've told me about and ask about, like, so starting with the office mates.
Mm-hmm.
What was it that you and the office mates would talk about on a regular basis?
In the beginning, we would talk about probably primarily two things. One, how weird and strange all of the Chinese things were that we were coming to contact with. And then two, kind of what the heck we were going to do in class that day. Because a lot of us, like myself, I had never taught before. And so we had really like no training in teaching. And I think we got our course schedules like 3 days before classes started. So I only knew what I was teaching like 3 days before classes started. I got my books. I wasn't given a syllabus or anything. So there was a lot of sort of like, what the heck are we doing with these students? And then sort of like a lot of like, what the heck are we doing in China?
Okay, so what about the advisors when you said that they would tell you things instead of like talk with you about stuff? What were
Right.
what were the kind of things they were telling you?
A lot of policies about the school. The school was half run by the Chinese Communist Party. So there was like a local division and an international division. So even the international division wasn't fully autonomous.
So half run, like they had some influence but not like control?
They had control of the local division and near control of the international division, but there was a lot of difference in like kind of what you could teach and what kind of approaches you could take, because it was supposed to be modeling like Western style education. So a lot of it was sort of acculturating us to what was expected of us in terms of being foreigners, but also being in a Communist Party affiliated school.
Okay.
And so like things like, you know, this is how exams work, this is when you give them, this is how you stop cheating, this is how, like, a big thing in the school was the leveling up test, because there was 4 levels of English instruction, and all of your classes would happen at whatever level you were placed in, and the higher the level, the better chance you had of getting to IB. International Baccalaureate is like a popular kind of educational curriculum for international schools that shows a particular amount of rigor.
So they'd have to, like, they'd get better instruction, or did they just have like a better grade overall if they moved into the higher
they would
grades?
have more challenging instruction that would enable them to move eventually in 11th and 12th grade into the IB program, those were basically the students that went to the top universities in the US.
Oh, okay.
And if you didn't get into those, into IB, you might not go to the top universities in the US.
I see.
Yeah. So there was a lot of kind of orientation and acculturation to those specific things in that context.
Okay. So then what about the students themselves? What would you talk with the students about?
Really about whatever was going on in class. So, I mean, for a lot of the students, like the English students, I saw them every day. For subject students like history, I would see them 2 or 3 times a week. So like the English students, you would have a better chance of creating rapport with them and kind of communicating with them more about their home life and, you know, how they're adjusting to living in a new place, because a lot of them had just moved. Some of them even lived on campus, so they were like boarding students. So they were kind of experiencing being away from family and friends for the first time. So a lot of that, and then just, you know, a lot of instructional communication based on, you know, we're preparing for this quiz that's coming up, we're preparing for this exam. Education in China is very exam focused on the whole and very grade focused. So kind of a lot of preparing for evaluations.
Okay. So, and you said that at the same time, these classes were modeled on Western education, right? So what was that like since you've been in Western education, what was it like having exam-focused Western education?
It was a little strange, maybe not so much because of the exam focus, because I think, even here, I mean, we have like standardized testing focus and we do like midterms and finals and things like that. And students in the US tend to be very grade focused as well. Really the difference was just that no one that I spoke to spoke English fluently. And so, that was really, for me, kind of the challenge that I had to deal with, that I was unprepared for. I mean, I knew that's what I was going into, but then, the realities of what that means.
So did you find ways to cope? Like, did you find ways to like handle it better as time went by?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I started to figure out the strategies that worked better in the classroom, ways for students, for example, like if you're going to try and have a discussion in your class, it's much more effective to give students time to plan on paper, and they might even plan on paper bilingually. So they might write it in Korean first and then you can use their translator to put it into English. So, I was kind of very quick in the beginning of, why aren't you talking back and why aren't you participating in discussion? But there were two problems there. One was cultural, which is that part of the Eastern style of education is that you have the sage on the stage, where I'm communicating information to you and you will be the recipient of that knowledge. Whereas for us, it's like we learn by communicating equally. And so I pose questions, you respond with answers, I reframe your answers into new questions, and we proceed that way. So, they really weren't prepared to do that. They were prepared to listen to a lot of information, but not really participate. And then, kind of grouped with that, the limitations of language made it really challenging. But, I started to develop some ways of dealing with that.
Okay, so that's how you adapted culturally. How did you find like ways to like compensate for the language barrier, like little language things that you could do that would get across a concept that may not be like just straight English? Like in computer communication, we call it compensation, where like putting something in asterisks to indicate that it's something you're physically doing instead of.
Okay. I think, probably the best thing that I created, and this was true of all of my communication throughout China, was pantomime. You really develop an ability to pantomime things that you otherwise would not have known you could pantomime. So I did in the first couple days before I even came into contact with school administrators, kind of went out into the community, and the first day I tried to buy two things. I tried to buy an alarm clock and I tried to buy some knitting supplies. Like, I don't know why I thought I needed to knit something in August in Shanghai. It's very hot, but it was like something that I did regularly in my life at home, and so I wanted to bring that with me. And so I was sort of like walking through a market, and I had to pantomime like an alarm clock. So I pretended to be asleep, and then I was like beep beep beep, and they got what I was doing. So I think I did a lot more kind of imitative gesticulating in the classroom and in my life in general before I started learning Chinese. But that would be one way. I've noticed actually, so I'm teaching now here at CMU. I teach English 101, and I use the whiteboard a lot less here than I did when I was teaching in China. And I think...
What were you using the whiteboard for?
In China? Well, I'm thinking that I was using it as sort of a crutch, or a way to better communicate what I was saying. So part of the problem with speaking is it happens very quickly. Mm-hmm. And so I had a suggestion early on from like a veteran teacher who had been there for a while, who said, in the beginning, like write everything you're saying on the board. It maybe not, full sentence, but like any concept that you're making, put it on the board, because one, it forces you to slow down, and two, it helps them to connect a visual cue to what is coming out of your mouth. And then you can back to it and sort of like point on the board and say, okay, remember when we were talking about this, rather than just saying, remember when we were talking about this, and they may not auditorily remember what that thing was. Whereas now I'm teaching, my class this year has all native speakers in English 101. So yeah, I really don't use the board as much because they can keep up with what I'm saying.
Okay. So let's go ahead and change gears and talk about Shanghai. Now, were you from a big city before you went there?
No, I had lived outside of mid-sized cities. Well, I guess Richmond, Virginia is a small city. Cincinnati, Ohio is a mid-sized city, I'd say, in the U.S.
Okay, to me, all of those are cities. So.
Okay. So I had lived in the suburbs of those cities. I went to an urban high school. But then for college, I lived in a town of 800 people. So that's what I was doing for the 4 years before I moved to
What college
Shanghai.
is in a town of 800 people?
It's called Lees McRae College. It's in the mountains of North Carolina. No one's ever heard, not even people who live there have ever heard of it.
So you're sure your undergraduate degree is real?
It is real. I don't think that's really funny. My undergraduate degree is real. My school truly did almost lose accreditation 2 years after I left, but they seem to be back on a better track now. But yeah, so that was really the context that I had most immediately come from, was living in the mountains of North Carolina. So I would not say, like, I think to be prepared at all to live in Shanghai, you would have to live in LA or New York. Like those are the only
That's
two.
the size of city that's comparable?
Even close. I mean, New York, I think, has 9 million people in it. Shanghai has like 24 million people in it. So it's kind of comparable, but like not really. And it'd be like if New York was twice the size in all Chinatown, right?
So it's basically like LA is a much more sprawling city than New York City.
Yeah.
So does that cut down like the density, the population density?
In Shanghai.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Shanghai is more, I would say more like LA in the sense that it is sprawling, but you get more of a sense of population density maybe than even in New York. Not as much as in Tokyo, right? Like Tokyo is even more densely populated. But yeah, I mean, you see people in your line of sight at any time of day all the time.
So who did you have relationships with in Shanghai that were outside of the program you were working in?
That didn't happen until maybe 6 or 8 months after I moved there. And I realized that there's a lot of high turnover in positions in China because people go there for a year to travel or whatever and then go back and move on and go to grad school or whatever else they do. So I kind of found out that a lot of my friends that I had made that year were going to be going to other places. And I was like, oh man, I got to make like friends that aren't in this school. Because like this school, just like people leave every year. So I met this group of urban biking enthusiasts that were sort of just coming about at the same time that I found out about them. It was very fortuitous. And they were really interested in playing bike polo. So I went to like the first bike polo match that they organized.
Now these are like motorcycle bikes.
No, like cycling bikes.
Okay.
Like bicycles. Bicycles. So I went to that and then I started hanging out with them a lot. And that was a mixed group. There were like Shanghainese, Chinese, Koreans, French people, Canadians, Americans. It was very international. But again, like most of the foreigners were learning Chinese, but didn't really like speak Chinese fluently. So the Chinese that we were hanging out with spoke pretty good English. They needed to speak pretty good English. So that was a group that I hung out with. And that was really like the main group that I hung out with outside of
the bike polo game.
Yeah. Now, when I
just a tangent real fast. were you any good at bike polo?
Yeah, I was awesome at it. I know, I was really good at it,
How
actually.
could you walk away from that kind of talent?
I don't know. I don't know what I was thinking. Yeah, we like even went to Beijing to play in a multi-city tournament, and I was on like the first all women's team, and we came in, I think, third of all the teams that were there from all over China. So yeah, I was sort of uncharacteristically aggressive at bike polo. And it was the very first team sport I'd ever played. I should preface this with, I did cycling in college. So I was on a cycling team there. So like, that's why I chose biking, because I had a bike and I really wanted to share that interest with people.
I'm trying to imagine you like hockey checking somebody on a bike with a croquet mallet.
It gets pretty dirty. Yeah, because you have like it's basically like a croquet mallet. It's a lot lighter because that would be hard to pedal around with. The first thing you have to have is really good maneuverability. And so, because you have to be biking with usually one, maybe no hands. Mm-hmm. And you need to be really brave about getting close to people and touching shoulders and using them as balance and that kind of thing. And then also like people get kind of really rudely aggressive and will like try and like put their mallet in your spokes, and that's not cool. Like that's frowned upon, but it happens. So that's why I chose to like find some bike people to hang out with. But then, so I was there for 3 years. Then I came back to do a master's in education. And then I went back again after that master's in education because I just wasn't done.
So how old are you?
I'm 29.
Okay. You're a lot older than I thought you were.
I'll take that as a compliment. You mean my high bouncy ponytail doesn't make me look like a respectable 39-year-old or 29-year-old?
Yeah, I didn't think you were 39.
Yeah, I'm not 39. I'm 29.
I was thinking more like 26 or 27. I was thinking more like my age.
Yeah, I'm 29. But then when I went back, I wasn't working in a large school. I ended up working at at different times, one and then the next, like sort of startups that were much, much smaller and didn't sort of have this safety net of foreigners.
Okay.
And so that was actually kind of a big transition period for me because I was really living very independently in the city. Like when I was teaching at the school, I lived on the campus with, like, it was basically like living in a dorm. All of the teachers we had our own apartments, but they were all in the same building on the campus where we taught. So it was all just sort of like very incestual and like everything is happening there. And then like we'd all go into the city together and hang out together and then come back together. Like just a lot of concentrated social time together. So when I started working at these two different startups, like it was a lot harder to navigate socially, especially for me because I tend to be kind of an introvert, so like meeting new people can be really overwhelming if it's not already sort of predetermined that like, hey, these are the people that you're going to hang out with. Kind of like what happens in like schools. When you're in a school, it's like, these are my friends because that's who's here. So navigating that was a little bit more difficult. And, you know, I continue to learn Chinese, but Chinese is a language that's very difficult to become fully fluent in if you're not like in a university program studying it. And since I was there always working, you know, the most I could do was like two-hour lessons each week. And that helps for like day-to-day stuff, like talking to the maid that came to my house each week and like asking her how she was and telling her this thing is a problem, or talking to a taxi cab driver. But you're not really going to make really meaningful friends with Chinese people if you can't speak Chinese or they can't fluently speak English. And if they fluently speak English, you tend to meet a similar type of person, someone that's had access to a level of education. Their family probably comes from a certain amount of money, maybe their parents studied abroad. And so it's really sort of predetermined in a sense, like who you're gonna be able to meet if you don't speak English, or if you don't speak Chinese, or they don't speak English. So yeah, so I had two very contrasting experiences.
Okay. Did you choose to go to the smaller schools after you came back?
Yeah, I did. So I wanted to kind of move on from the experience of the international school, and I wanted to try out my skills in a new context.
So you sort of made the decision to challenge yourself.
I didn't know if it was going to be a challenge or not. It ended up being a challenge. It ended up being kind of difficult, just because working in a small multicultural startup, you have to navigate the things that are already difficult with working in a startup, which is being like super committed to the job, really entrepreneurial. Which, I mean, I've never even taken a business class. Like, what do I really know about? I know a lot about education, and by that point I knew really a lot about the educational market in Shanghai specifically, and how to work with students and how to talk to parents. But I didn't know anything about running a business. And then, there's just kind of constant cultural tension about how, like, what the direction a company should take, how the day-to-day operation should go, and just kind of those tensions. And I learned that I'm not very good at dealing with tension in the workplace.
Okay. So when you went to the startups, like, since you didn't have the safety net, what was the communication like? How did it change when you didn't have that safety net for you?
Outside of work?
Yeah.
I'm trying to think. So I still had a few friends that were at the school, because they still were there from when I left and came back. And I had friends from the school who had also transitioned out into the city, and were working in other jobs, like in a law firm, as a manager in a law firm. And so, because there was now sort of this balance between people being on the campus and people being off the campus, that social network sort of blossomed outward. And so, I made friends with people that my friends were making friends with.
Okay, so there was sort of like this, you had a core group, and then like blowing on a dandelion, when they spread out.
Right, so they spread out, and one friend would have these other friends, and I would go hang out with them. And sometimes you would even manage to kind of like jump, and like that person's friend became your actual friend, not just like, oh, there's so-and-so's friend. It was like, no, they're now actually my friend, and they're in my circle. And like Shanghai is very, very open within the expat community, I think, within the foreigner community, because nobody there has an establishment really, right? So no one there has their family. This is within there's kind of two different kind of foreigners, I guess. There's like the young foreigner that's out for adventure and maybe some money. And then there's like the old foreigner, the older foreigner who has been sent over by their company. And they get sort of these sweet deals. They get like a huge amount of money for rent, and they get a private driver, and they live in like these communities of that kind of foreigner. So there's that kind of foreigner. But for my kind of foreigner, and I would say they're more closed off, right? They have their family and their wife and their children, and or their husband and their children, because trailing husbands were on the rise when I was leaving. But for my group, it's very much like you could go out to a bar and make friends with new people. And it wouldn't be totally strange to end up like going on a trip with them in a month, like someone that you had kind of just happened upon. Just because, yeah, there's no real establishment. Whereas, a place like Mount Pleasant, like everyone kind of already has their situated friend groups, and they're not really in need of like new friends or expanding social networks or anything like that. So it wasn't too difficult kind of once there were people that were branching out.
Okay. So This is going to sound like a strange question, but there's a point.
Mm-hmm.
Did you date when you were in the U.S. so that you can compare it to the experience with dating in China?
Actually, I won't be able to give a very good comparison because I was sort of a serial monogamist in the U.S. So I had like a series of long-term relationships basically from high school until the end of college.
Serial monogamists are not unheard of in America. Like I wouldn't downplay the relevance of being a serial monogamist because I think most Americans end up being serial monogamists personally.
It's not relevant to what I was in Shanghai.
That's funny. So there was a difference.
Well, so in the beginning, like I would say that, you know, the first year that I was there, I didn't really settle down with anyone. And then the second year I kind of, halfway through the second year, I sort of started what became a long-term relationship. But then once that finally ended, which was by the time I came back the second time, I was sort of like, whoa. Like, we just need to chill it out here for a minute. And so I dated kind of like casually for the first time in my life. But again, like...
What was it about being in China that made you feel like you could date casually, or that prompted you to change to dating casually?
I don't know if it was China in particular, or if it would just be that wherever I was at that point in my life, I would have said, hey, like, what I'm trying, I'm just sort of like hitting my head against a wall, so maybe I should just like loosen up and not be so insistent on making.
So you felt
something.
like you were the one making the decision towards serial monogamy before you were changing afterwards?
Yeah, I don't know that I was making a decision before, but I made a decision to not do that for a little while. I mean, obviously not that long. So I just sort of dated, like I signed up on OkCupid, is available in China, which is the only international dating platform that's available. But again, like I'm realizing in this interview that I just sound like I went to China and hung out with a bunch of foreigners, which isn't, you know, it's not totally untrue. And really, like the time that I spent with Chinese people was with my students and their families, and Chinese cab drivers who I made a lot of friends with. And then like I had, you know, a couple of closer Chinese friends, like my tutor was my good friend. And I'm actually still working on a business thing with her boyfriend, who is also my good friend, who is my old boss. So there's like these networks that exist. But yeah, so I dated mostly foreign guys, just, you know, like go out for dinner, meet someone. I kept telling myself, so my friend group at the time was sort of like, oh yeah, girls gotta eat. That's how they would say it. But the way that I thought about it was sort of like, I'd always been a little bit socially awkward, and I think I tended to find a relationship and stay in it because it was easier than interacting with new people all the time. And so, you know, I kind of said like, oh, like I think dating skills should be something that you can list on a resume, right? Like being able to just like meet with someone and entertain them and be entertained for like the next 3 hours.
Strong first impression skills, great conversationalist. I see what you mean.
Right, yeah. So, yeah, I was like very kind of against the grain in the beginning. But, you know, I like made it through one date and then made it through another date, and it wasn't as bad as I thought it would be. And, yeah.
So what would the communication, like what would you guys talk about be? What would it be like?
I think, you know, there's sort of there's sort of like this list that you go through when you first meet someone in Shanghai, which is super awesome because like there's not really a similar list. I think when you meet someone in the US, like you might be like, oh, what do you do here? Like if you're here, you kind of assume that they're a student or a professor at the university, right? And you kind of like already know. But in Shanghai, like there's so many different people from so many different places that, you know, you go to a bar, you meet a new person, or you go on a date, you meet a new person, and it's, you know, where are you from? What are you doing here? How long have you been here? You know, what other countries have you traveled to? Like, there was really a shared experience going on in being a foreigner in that particular region of the world, that made it pretty easy to have conversation with people.
Is that the touchstone that you guys would particularly talk about, or?
That'd be the starting off point. Yeah. So you talk about, you know, what kind of work do you do, and how long do you think you'll be here? How long have you been here? What countries have you traveled to? What other ones do you want to travel to? Why did you move to China? You know, things like that.
Do any particularly great conversations stick out in your mind?
Well, I mean, not to be biased, like Joe and I are where we are right now for a pretty good reason. So yeah, we met up at like a Belgian beer bar, which again, like, why were we two Americans meeting at a Belgian bar in China? I don't know. And like, I ate mac and cheese. And I just come from tutoring some Korean students. And yeah, we just talked about, well, when you date online, right? So we met online first. You kind of get like a primer, right? You already know a little bit about what you're going to talk about, or at least what that other person does. So he had mentioned like his research in aliens and his work in debate and how he likes to explore ideas. And so yeah, we talked about the thing that made our date unique was that we talked about things not on the list that I just told you. So some of the less successful dates would pretty much just rehash these same topics for like 2 hours, which just, what can you do with that? I don't know. But Joe and I, we had more to talk about, and we had kind of a shared background. So he had grown up in Virginia. I had grown up part of my life in Virginia. Like, I come from a semi-academic family. Like, Joe is obviously an academic. I want to get my PhD, you know, kind of all of these kinds of things. So we were just able to talk about a lot more than some of the other dates. But, you know, the other dates were kind of like I said, kind of skill building. So I was kind of figuring out, like, how do I make this turn around? And, you know, how do I kind of calculate what I'm going to say about myself so that, you know, I'm reserving some privacy, but I'm also seeming like I'm opening up. Whereas before, like, I would just be like, blah, whoa, I don't know, okay, like, that's my life. And I learned that that's great for friends and not great for dates.
So you learned how to pace your self-disclosure.
Yes, except I did not do that on our date.
So you built up all these skills and then you just threw them all away because you didn't need them anymore, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. Also, we had like definitely about 4 too many beers each. So that...
You say 4 beers, like that's a big number of beers.
Like 4 too many. So like whatever the number is, plus 4 more than that.
I don't know. I can't get drunk.
Oh.
It's sad.
That is sad.
It's sad.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for talking with me.
Yeah, I hope that you don't write that I'm a racist foreigner, which is what it sounds like.
I didn't hear the racist part. What was the racist part?
I don't know, just that I was like, yeah, and then I talked to some foreigners, and then I talked to some other foreigners, and then like, yeah, there were some Chinese people, and they were just kind of telling me what to do. And then, oh yeah, and then there was my maid. But that's not really how it was.
Was the maid hired by the university, or was the maid, like, you just had a maid for whatever reason?
Well, it's actually a really common kind of like economic and social construct in China. It's called ai, and it's like a middle-aged woman that either doesn't work or works part-time and then goes to clean houses for like a couple hours a week. So it's really like, it doesn't, like having an IE, it doesn't have really the same stigma here that having a maid might, or like even really the same notion of privilege. Like I mean, pretty much like an IE could hire an IE, right? Like, and she probably does. She probably doesn't clean her own house. She just goes to clean other people's houses. But yeah, they're like very cheap and they come in and they work. But my IE was through my tutor, my friend Nell. So, I mean, I guess like that is kind of one takeaway or overview, which is that things are very network based. So if you're limited in language, like you're going to meet a few key people who are kind of your, not gatekeeper in the sense that like, well, I guess they do. They either enable or prevent you from getting to other things that you need. But really more like a facilitator that kind of connects you to this vast community of Chinese only speakers and services and all those kinds of things.
Someone that could translate for you, basically.
Yeah, pretty much. Pretty much. Like, a lot of it was, you know, I could meet with my IE and tell her about a problem in the apartment, or okay, I'm going to be back at this time, or you know, I'm not going to be here next week, so don't, whatever. I could talk to her about these different things. But the process of like, if she quit on me, right? The process of finding a new IE, I don't know, right? Like, I don't know how that, there's no like Craigslist. I mean, there probably is a Craigslist for IEs in China, but it's all in Chinese.
The little perforated signs on street poles and stuff like that, where you just take the tab with the phone number on it.
Probably. I mean, that, I don't even think that exists. So a lot of it is really like based upon pre-existing networks, and a lot of the things that happen in China are sort of within this informal relations or economies. Actually, there's a concept in China called guanxi.
I was going to say, do the people in China, are they like very conscious of the networking?
Yeah. So the concept of guanxi is like who you know. It's a lot of power. It's kind of like social capital. Who is social capital? Bordeaux. But the idea that like the people you know are your resources. And you want to keep really good relations with everyone. Even if maybe you personally don't really love that person, like you want to keep a good relation with them because they probably know someone who can help you with this problem down the line. So like if you have really good guanxi like that, that means you can get maybe a business deal to go through, or you know, you can find a really good IE if yours quits on you. Like something as important as a business deal to as mundane as like finding a replacement for your IE. So, I mean, I do think that it is pretty network based, which is probably partially what makes it difficult for foreigners to kind of feel fully immersed. You're always sort of experiencing it through a colleague, or for me, through my students and their parents, or through my sort of key gatekeepers, like my tutor.
So like you'd rely on their network more than like building your own. But it sounded like you had a pretty robust network to me.
Maybe. Like my tutor and my colleagues who are Chinese, a couple of friends, but then really just like a lot of foreigners. Yeah.
So your network was sort of like isolated, but they knew people who could know other people for you guys.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I would say that's how it works. And like, I think, you know, it is sort of probably like something I have a I'm worried about. There's definitely the notion that foreigners show up in China and just aren't there to experience China. They're there to kind of like live more cheaply, get a better job, travel around, and, you know, essentially live in New York City like it costs to live in Mount Pleasant. And so, you know, for some people, maybe that's true. But I think for a lot of people, there are real barriers. Like even if you had like a working knowledge of Chinese and could get around functionally throughout the day, that really isn't enough to get you fully immersed in the networks, I think, that exist there. So you're kind of always...
So the language barrier is supplemented by a cultural barrier.
What do you mean by that?
So like not only, like once you learn the language, that's not enough to be able to start accessing these networks.
Yeah, because learning Chinese at sort of a functional level isn't really the same as learning, say, Spanish at a functional level. Because once you've learned the basics of Spanish, it's really easy to use things in your day, like what in language studies you'd call realia, like newspapers and advertisements. Like you can learn from those things. It takes a lot more skill and knowledge in Chinese to be able to do that, because written Chinese is so complicated and not really, for a foreigner learning Chinese, not really connected to what is being spoken. So like, you know, I could know how to say something and have no idea what it looks like on paper, or I could be able to read everything on a piece of paper, like say what each character, the pronunciation of each character, and I have no idea what it means.
And that's because the characters in Chinese are historical artifacts, aren't they? Like a lot of them are based on like the buildup of the language over thousands of years of like, now this character has this other meaning, and now there's two characters put together. Now 4 characters are put together into one character.
Yeah, exactly. So I might know this particular sound or like phoneme and this particular phoneme, but when they're put together, they make a new meaning that I don't know. So like, I can give you a good example. I was studying for the, oh shoot, what is it called? The Chinese, like, the Chinese equivalent of the TOEFL, like the test of the English language. It's called the, I can't remember right now, but I was studying for like a mid-level of that. So mid-level, like not beginner, not expert, but like really sturdily in the middle. Like I know things about Chinese. And we were doing a listening practice, and the whole listening practice, I was like, yep, I know what's happening. I'm gonna be able to answer all my tutor's questions. And she was like, yeah, what's happening? And I was like, oh, the student needs help with her homework, but her grandfather doesn't want to help her. And she was like, no. The kid came back from school and had dirty shoes, and the grandfather wants to know why. And I was just like, what? Because all of the tones and the sounds were just so slightly off that if you would put them into the constructions that I had heard before, that's what it would have meant, helping with homework. In this new context or these new tones, it meant something totally different. And so that's really kind of one of the reasons why I think foreigners going to China who haven't had any exposure to Chinese have such a hard time kind of integrating. And you know, I've seen people do it. They do it, and they work really hard to do it, and they decide basically speaking Chinese fluently is something that I have to do to obtain these other goals in my life. But for a lot of foreigners who are in China, that's not what happened. So like I never took the higher levels of this test because I realized, you know, like I don't really need to speak Chinese fluently to get by. Like I'm doing okay, I'm functional, I'm not going to talk about politics and art with anyone, but I don't need to do that to do what I think I'm planning to do in my life. So I think everyone kind of comes to that conclusion. If they're sort of like a lot of people just don't really study Chinese while they're there.
I studied Chinese.
Mm-hmm. And then some people study, but like it's a thing that they do after work or on the weekends, and kind of they get to a point where they're like, okay, like enough. I know enough, and I'm not going to be any better because I know more Chinese. So
Okay.
So hopefully that's a helpful clarification.
I thought it was interesting at least. Okay, well, thank you for talking.
Yes, thank you for listening.